Okay, let's continue on.
And it would not be until the progressive movement later on at the early 20th century where you're going to see more effective regulations being put in place. Now, during this time, you also have the rise of other industries, the heavy industries. Railroad is just one, but you have oil, steel, and coal.
You've got to know the major industries of this era. Railroad, oil, steel are the number ones, with coal being another one. Then you also have the financial industry, which will be led by people like J.P. Morgan, where they are loaning all this money out to these industries and helping them to create, the capital that they need in order to be successful.
As well. And kind of the two figures that you should definitely know about is John D. Rockefeller, the head of Standard Oil, and Andrew Carnegie, the guy in the steel industry.
All right, no Rockefeller, think of oil. No Carnegie, think of steel, very innovative in the steel industry. You also need to know Vanderbilt was a head of, one of the leading railroad industrial tycoons. And then, as I mentioned before, J.P. Morgan was the head of, or pretty much the head of the financial industry. Those are the four major figures that led this economy because they led these major industries. Now, I've talked to you about this before, captains of industry or robber barons. I would encourage you to go read about these people and see if you can determine whether or not you think that they were more of captains of industry, which is a positive viewpoint of these guys, or if they were more like robber barons. As captains of industry, they would be described as people who were innovative, who drove the economy, who created massive amounts of wealth. As robber barons, they would be people who, who skirted the law, who tried to manipulate politicians into doing their bidding. They paid their workers low wages and made them work in poor conditions and really made people poor. So it's really just a point of view that you might have. But either one would need to be supported with evidence. So I would like you to read in chapter 24 about these individuals and see what you think in terms of whether they were robber barons or captains of industry.
And it's important while you're reading to understand whether or not these people should be viewed as captains of industry or robber barons. Key concepts for this time period, business practices done, was something called horizontal integration. Make sure you know about that. And this is controlling all competition in a particular industry, merging competing, for example, oil companies. Rockefeller did this into one giant corporation, and you want to consolidate all competitors so you have no competition or very little competition so that you are able to monopolize the market.
Okay. This was done mostly by the oil companies that were led by Rockefeller. There would be a lot of little oil refineries, and he would just buy them up, and they would become part of his oil company. That is horizontal integration. So when you think of the horizon, it's flat. So you're talking about people who are in your industry. You're all on the same level. You're all in doing the same thing. So it's a flat, horizontal view of that industry, and essentially he would take those industries over and become a monopoly.
And so horizontal integration was done by these business leaders such as Rockefeller. The other one is vertical integration, and this one is controlling all aspects of manufacturing, from extracting the raw materials to selling the finished product. And the idea behind this business practice is you improve efficiency by making supplies much more reliable. You eliminate the middleman, and you're able to control all stages of production.
Okay, in vertical integration, which was mainly done by Carnegie and in the steel industry, they would take over other parts of the creation of their product, not just they wouldn't take over other businesses that did the same thing that they did. They would take over businesses that helped in the creation of what they were creating. So in other words, they would control all aspects of manufacturing for a good, from extracting raw materials to selling the finished product. In other words, it would look something like McDonald's serves hamburgers. Instead of taking over Burger King and Wendy's, instead of doing that, which would be horizontal integration, what they're going to do is they're going to buy farms that grow cattle. They're going to buy bread manufacturing companies. They're going to do all that so that those organizations are going to help them to produce their finished product. So they're buying up all these other smaller industries that they need in order to create their final product, if that makes any sense.
And this was done by Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry. And these vertical integration strategies and horizontal integration strategies were very effective at increasing profits and eliminating competitors. Now, what happens during this time is you began to get these ideas about this changing society as people began to look for ways to explain the social order of the Gilded Age. And remember, the key idea with regard to regulation in government was this idea of laissez-faire, to leave alone. The government should not attempt to control or regulate business. And some individuals, such as Herbert Spencer, the Wolverine's father figure you see right there, was an English social philosopher, and he took Charles Darwin's ideas about the natural world and applied them to the world of business. And it's this idea of survival of the fittest, that the wealthy were fit, hardworking, whereas the poor were just the weak in society, and therefore they should not be helped, and we should advocate for laissez-faire. There were other ideas, for example, the gospel of wealth. There was a belief that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help out those who were less fortunate. And Andrew Carnegie advocated in the famous article called Wealth that the rich have a moral obligation to make it rain, to donate to those individuals in need by donating to charity and hospitals.
Okay, ideas of the Industrial Revolution. We've already talked about laissez-faire. We've talked about this relentlessly, so I'm going to let it go. Survival of the fittest. This is Darwin's idea about biology, about the natural world, but people wanted to apply this notion to the business world. In other words, survival of the fittest in the business world would mean those who are most creative, those who are the smartest and the most innovative and the most efficient, they're going to be the ones who succeed in this economy. And those who are not like that, they will fail. Now, this would be an example of laissez-faire economics or of free market capitalism. Problem is, it never really works that way. We have government bailout programs for industries that are failing or companies that are failing, and so there's almost never a real application of survival of the fittest when it comes to the economy. Gospel of wealth, the belief that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help those out who are less fortunate. Andrew Carnegie sort of adopted this idea, and he gave a lot of money to help poor people and to help society in general. A lot of his wealth was given over to other to causes that he thought were important, and that again, it goes to the notion that if you are rich, if you are wealthy, if you have attained a lot of this wealth, then you have an obligation, you have a duty to try to help the rest of society, especially those who are less fortunate than you. So these two ideas kind of go against one another, because under survival of the fittest, people in society who aren't successful and who are poor and who are living in really bad conditions, people who believe this would say, well, then it's their own fault. We just got to let them go. We got to let them be consumed by the economy or whatever. Whereas people who believed in the gospel of wealth, like Andrew Carnegie, said, no, we need to help. But notice, he's not advocating that government come in and help necessarily. He's saying we as individuals need to help. We need to take it upon ourselves to do that.
In public libraries and so on. And Carnegie's going to donate huge amounts of money to those different causes. In spite of these different ideas, there was continuing to be a public outcry of the growing corporate power. And in 1890, you get a very significant act of government regulation called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this outlawed trust and other monopolies that fixed prices or restrained trade.
I'm not against stuff like this where you're making sure that there are free market principles in place and that people don't abuse other people, that people are, playing by the same rules and trying to, trying to become successful the right way. That's fine. The only question that I have is, the government's watching us. Well, who's watching them? Where are the laws that regulate their behavior? Because they're just as much a part of this corruption that was going on as the big businesses. How come nobody was calling for them to be regulated or them to be thrown out of office altogether? Instead, it's always, it's somebody else's fault. That's the way the government works. They want to blame these corporations and these businesses that were doing this when they were the ones that were allowing it to happen because they were benefiting. And they were the ones creating the laws that helped these organizations to do what they were doing because these politicians were benefiting.
And once again, the government is going to be watching and monitoring business. Just like the Interstate Commerce Act, though, in the beginning, it's not very effective at regulating corporate power and abuse. And in fact, the Sherman Antitrust Act is ironically used against labor unions to break them up during this time period.
All right. So one of the themes of legislation during this time period that was designed to try to control these companies and these industries is that they initially were not very effective. Okay. So that needs to be something that you think about, that yes, there were calls for regulation of these industries. The government responded to those calls by passing laws. However, those laws were not very effective, at least in the beginning.
And that leads us to labor unions.
All right, first of all, let's talk about what a labor union is. This is literally, if I am working in a big factory and I'm upset with the conditions, or I want a raise, or I need some extra time off, or I want our hours to be lowered, or I want to be paid overtime or whatever, and I go complain to the boss about these conditions, well, I don't have a lot of power. There's probably 100 people waiting to get my job. So he just says, well, if you don't like it, you can leave. So where does that leave me? I have no bargaining power because there's so many people that would be in line for that job. However, if I do this, but I do it with the rest of the people who work in this factory, and we go and we share our collective issues with the person who owns this factory, they're going to be far more likely to listen to our demands and maybe even meet those demands, because you can't replace all of us. If we decide to quit, then your business is going to be shut down, and it may only be temporary, but temporary is a long time for these business owners because that's a lot of money that they will lose. So workers would form labor unions like that, where they come together and they fight for a common issue or a common set of issues, and it gives them more leverage with the owner of the factory or the organization, business, whatever.
Unions, the labor movement, is going to challenge this pro-business climate. They're going to confront corporate power, but they're going to have a lot of challenges during this period as well. There was a division between skilled and unskilled workers. Should you organize the skilled and unskilled together? There were ethnic and racial divisions. Very often labor unions were anti-Chinese immigrants and other groups. You had hostility from corporations and no protection by the government. In fact, scabs, replacement workers, were often brought in when workers went on strike. Court injunctions were used to force workers back into the factory. Yellow dog contracts, a worker had to agree to sign them, and therefore they could not join a union. Blacklist if you were involved in the movement, where you were banned from working in certain industries. And public opinion was very often against unions because they were oftentimes viewed as being radical.
Okay, now, real quick. Unions are not a bad thing. They're not as necessary today as they were back then. Back then, you were working in really, really bad conditions, and the only way to really try to improve those is to gain some leverage. And this is the way that they would gain leverage. Now, because of a lot of the work that these unions did back then, we have laws in place that protect us as workers. And so now there's this conflict between labor. When I say labor, I'm talking about unions. There's this conflict between labor and business owners, and it really boils down to a difference of philosophy and about what the economy is designed for. Okay, and unions are still important, but they're not as vital as they were back then. Having said that, make sure that you know what some of the issues were that unions faced. First of all, within unions, there were skilled and unskilled workers. So how would those come together? You had ethnic and racial divisions. Oftentimes, these unions would ban the Irish from being a part of it, or black people from being a part of their union, or whatever. Then there were some unions that allowed all these people to be in their union. There were some unions that allowed skilled and unskilled workers, and some that only allowed skilled workers. So all of those were issues. And here are some tactics that were used to try to limit the power of unions and limit the influence of unions. You need to know these terms. Scabs. These are literally replacement workers for when unions would go on strike. Yellow dog contracts. These were contracts that you would have to sign to get a job, promising that you would not join a union, and then you could have the job. Blacklists. If you were a part of the blacklist, that probably meant that you were a part of a union and were probably somebody who is sort of a troublemaker in these industries' eyes. So they would blacklist you and prevent you from working. Okay, so those are three important terms that you need to know as being tactics used against unions to limit their influence.
In spite of these challenges, you're going to see the growth of the national labor movement.
Pay attention to these labor unions that were created, the names of them, when they were created, who was in them, some of the leaders that were involved, what groups were a part of these unions. Pay attention to these.
You see the National Labor Union formed in 1866. They're the first attempt to organize workers in all the different states. They demand things like higher wages and an 8-hour workday, but they're going to have trouble sustaining that movement. The Knights of Labor is also one you should know about. 1869, Terence Powderly opened the union to all workers, skilled and unskilled workers. This was unique, and also included women and African Americans in the movement. They're going to decline following the Haymarket riot in 1886. We'll take a look at that in a second. And the most important one is the American Federation of Labor in 1886. Samuel Gompers, under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, they're going to focus on skilled workers, and they're going to focus really not on social issues, but what are known as bread and butter issues, issues such as wages and working conditions.
All right, real quick, I want to show you something. If you were writing an essay about labor unions, I want you to look at all of the specific factual information in this. You have scabs, yellow dog contracts, blacklists, National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, Terence Powderly, the Haymarket riot, which we're going to talk about, or he's going to talk about here in just a second, the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, bread and butter issues. Know the difference between those and what social issues were being debated in American society at the time. Bread and butter issues were literally just about wages and working conditions. They didn't want to talk about social issues outside of the workplace. They wanted to talk about bread and butter issues. All of that could be a part of an essay that you wrote about labor unions, and all of those things are pieces of specific factual information that you would need to know.
So none of that social stuff that the Knights of Labor was famous for. And
all right, so real quick, which of these labor unions focused more on social issues? The Knights of Labor. Which one focused more on things in the workplace? American Federation of Labor. All right. Which one had skilled and unskilled and African Americans and women? The Knights of Labor. Which one limited it to skilled workers? The American Federation of Labor. All right, so you've got to know all of these little details about these unions.
By 1900, they will be the largest labor union in the nation, but they will have limited success in the beginning. There's going to be a lot of examples of labor unrest throughout the country, and you're going to see that on this map, all those areas in pink. There were some sort of strikes happening, and some major ones you should know.
All right, real quick, let me rewind it a little bit here. All right. These are all the pink areas are where you had some form of labor unrest, where there were strikes, whatever, just small instances. However, the red ones are huge events that took place. So you've got the Great Railroad Strike, you've got the Homestead Strike, you've got the Haymarket Riot in Chicago, you've got the Pullman Strike. All right. The Great Railroad Strike, by the way, was in multiple cities where this took place. So these are the major strikes that you need to be familiar with. Great Railroad Strike, Homestead Strike, Haymarket Riot, and the Pullman Strike. Those are the big strikes that took place that had major implications.
Labor unrest throughout the country, and you're going to see that on this map, all those areas in pink. There were some sort of strikes happening, and some major ones you should know about for APUSH. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes eventually sends in the federal troops to end the labor unrest.
The first time troops were sent in to stop a strike was this Rutherford B. Hayes doing so in 1877.
In 1886, there's the famous Haymarket bombing, where a bomb explodes during a public meeting in Haymarket Square near Chicago. And although it was the work of radical anarchists, a bunch of people end up getting arrested, and the public views the labor union as a whole as a radical and violent movement.
All right, the Haymarket bombing, it led to a decline in the popularity of unions. So union membership drops after this because people blamed labor unions for this explosion, and it was not a good thing.
And so that suffers. Labor unions suffer a setback during this event. And of course, Homestead Strike, 1892, Henry Clay Frick uses a lockout, private security guards known as Pinkertons and scabs to defeat steelworkers at Andrew Carnegie's.
Pinkertons were private guards used to keep people out of the factory.
And we'll talk about the Pullman Strike and Eugene Debs in another lecture. So make sure you understand how workers responded to this changing industrial economy and how business leaders justified their wealth. That's going to do it.
All right. First of all, one more thing real quick. The Pullman Strike, which we'll talk about later. You should already know what that strike deals with, like what industry it would deal with. The Pullman cars, which were railroad cars. So that's going to be a railroad strike. All right, that's it for chapter 24.